There's a mistake I see almost every gardener make, and it's usually the reason their crops get stripped by pests, while someone else's garden right down the road stays mostly untouched. They plant their vegetables the way a supermarket shelf is arranged. Tomatoes in one block, cabbage in another, lettuce lined up in a tidy row. Everything separated, everything uniform. And from a pest's perspective, that's not a garden, that's a menu. A moth looking for cabbages can spot that block from across the yard by scent alone. An aphid landing anywhere in the tomato patch is already on its target. You've done half the work for them. The gardeners whose crops survive the season mostly intact aren't luckier. They're not more experienced. They've just broken up the signal. They've planted specific herbs and flowers between and around their vegetables. Plants that confuse pests, overwhelm their senses, pull them off course, or bring in the insects that eat them. And once you know which 10 plants do this reliably, you can apply the same strategy to your own beds this week. But before I walk you through them, I need to be honest about something, because plenty of gardening content skips this part, and it causes real disappointment later. Companion planting does not eliminate pests. It reduces pressure. It tilts the odds. It makes your garden a harder target, not an invisible one. If someone tells you that a ring of marigolds means you'll never see an aphid again, they're selling you a fantasy. What companion planting actually does, when it's done with intention, is layer several natural defenses together so that fewer pests arrive, fewer stay, and the ones that slip through have predators already waiting. That's not magic. But over a full season, it's the difference between a decent harvest and watching half your crop disappear to caterpillars. It works best as part of a larger system, alongside crop rotation, healthy soil, and your own regular walks through the garden. Let me show you 10 plants that earn their place in that system. Let's start with the aromatic herbs, because this is where the science is strongest, and the results are easiest to see in your first season. The core idea is simple. Most pest insects don't find your vegetables by sight. They find them by smell. Aphids, cabbage moths, carrot flies, whiteflies, tomato hornworm moths. They navigate toward chemical signals released by their host plants. When you surround those crops with strongly scented herbs, you disrupt that navigation. The pest still senses food is somewhere nearby, but it can't lock onto the signal cleanly. Think of trying to follow one conversation in a crowded room. The voice is there, but the noise around it makes it nearly impossible to track. Basil is the clearest example. Its leaves release eugenol, linalool, and citronellol, compounds that create a dense aromatic cloud around the plant. When you tuck basil between tomato plants, which most of us do anyway for the kitchen, you're creating a zone where tomato hornworm moths have a much harder time identifying the tomato as a safe place to lay eggs. Hornworms are moth larvae. The adult moth searches for tomatoes by scent before laying, so disrupt that search and you disrupt the whole life cycle. The same aromatic interference works on aphids, whiteflies, and thrips around peppers, eggplants, and lettuce. But here's the part most people get wrong. One basil plant in a corner isn't enough. You need clusters. 6 or 8 plants tucked between and around your crops, close enough that the scent actually mingles with the air above your vegetables. A lone basil plant makes your garden smell nice. A deliberate planting creates enough volatile concentration to genuinely interfere with how pests find your crops. Rosemary works on the same principle, but offers something basil can't: permanence. It's a woody, semi-evergreen shrub in most temperate climates, hardy in USDA zones 7 and up without protection. And it releases camphor and cineole continuously through its needle-like leaves. These resinous compounds are especially disruptive to cabbage moths and carrot flies. Plant rosemary along the borders of beds where you grow brassicas, and you've built a scented barrier that lasts for years. It doesn't need replanting. It doesn't need much watering once it's established. In dry, full sun positions that would stress most vegetables, rosemary thrives. That makes it ideal for the outer edges of raised beds and plot margins where nothing productive would normally grow anyway. You're turning dead space into a defensive perimeter that also gives you a cooking herb year-round. Thyme is the ground-level version of the same strategy. low, spreading, dense mats of aromatic foliage that release thymol when warmed by the sun or brushed by wind. Plant it around the base of brassicas, along paths where you walk past daily, and between stepping stones. Every time you step near it, you trigger a fresh burst of scent into the air around your crops. Cabbage whites and whiteflies are the primary targets, and the honest observation from plenty of experienced growers is that brassica beds with thyme edging consistently see less caterpillar damage than beds without it. Not zero damage, but noticeably less. And because thyme is perennial and drought-tolerant in most climates, it's a plant-at-once solution that keeps working season after season with almost no input from you. Lavender adds another layer, especially if you garden near a seating area or a pathway. Its linalool content repels moths, flies, and mosquitoes. And the evidence for that goes back centuries in the form of dried lavender sachets used to keep moths out of wardrobes. The same volatile compounds that work in a cupboard work in the air around a garden border. Its value as a direct vegetable protector is more modest than basil or rosemary, but lavender earns its spot another way. When it blooms, bees cover it. More pollinator traffic near your squash, tomatoes, and cucumbers means better fruit set and heavier harvests. So lavender works twice over, as a mild deterrent at the garden's edges, and as a pollinator magnet that improves yields on everything fruiting nearby. Mint is the most aggressive of the aromatic group, and I mean that literally. Its menthol-rich oils overwhelm the scent receptors of ants, aphids, flea beetles, and cabbage moths. That's the upside. The downside is that mint spreads underground through runners, and will colonize an entire bed in a single season if you let it. I've watched mint take over a 3-foot-wide raised bed and crowd out the carrots and lettuce that were supposed to be the main crop. So the rule with mint is simple: grow it in containers. A pot of mint at the corner of a raised bed near your brassicas or along a pathway gives you all the aromatic benefit with none of the invasion. Here's a bonus worth knowing. Ants actively avoid mint, and ants are often the reason aphid colonies survive, because ants farm aphids for their honeydew and protect them from predators. Disrupt the ants, and you weaken the entire aphid support system. Now, before we go further, one honest thing to hold on to: no single aromatic herb is a complete solution. Research from the Royal Horticultural Society and several U.S. cooperative extension services is consistent on this point. Aromatic masking reduces pest pressure. It doesn't prevent it. The real power of companion planting comes from layering multiple mechanisms together at the same time. The herbs I've just covered handle the scent disruption piece. What comes next handles the other two. And when all three layers are working, the results in a real garden become hard to ignore. The second layer of defense doesn't rely on confusing pests through the air. It uses chemistry inside the plant itself. And the most powerful plants in this category are the alliums: onions, garlic, chives, leeks, shallots. They all share the same family and the same underground weapon: sulfur compounds. When allium roots grow in soil, they release organosulfur chemicals into the surrounding area. When their leaves are bruised or brushed, they release even more into the air. These compounds are the same ones that make your eyes water when you chop an onion. To us, that's a kitchen nuisance. To aphids, spider mites, Japanese beetles, carrot rust flies, and several leaf-chewing pests, it's a chemical environment they actively avoid. This isn't folklore. It's straightforward plant chemistry, and it's been validated by research in both organic agriculture journals and university extension programs. Chives are the easiest allium to work with in a mixed vegetable garden. They stay compact, they don't spread aggressively, and they're perennial in most temperate climates, coming back every spring in denser clumps than the year before. Plant them around the base of rose bushes, which aphids love, and you'll see the aphid pressure drop noticeably. Plant them near carrots, and you interfere with the carrot rust fly's ability to locate its target. Carrot rust fly is one of the most frustrating pests a gardener can deal with, because the damage happens underground, and you don't see it until harvest. The adult fly finds carrot patches by scent, and the strong sulfur signal from chives masks the carrot aroma enough to reduce egg-laying in the soil. Plant a ring of chives at each corner of a carrot bed. That's the traditional placement, and it holds up in practice. When chives bloom, their purple pom-pom flowers also attract hoverflies and parasitic wasps, which brings us to the beneficial insect layer I'll cover shortly. Garlic is the heavyweight of the allium family. Its allicin content is stronger than any other common kitchen allium, and the compounds extend their influence into the surrounding soil to a greater degree. Planted in a ring around fruit trees, garlic reduces aphid pressure on the lower branches and helps suppress some fungal problems in the soil around the roots. Tucked between rows of lettuce, peppers, and strawberries, it creates zones that aphids and spider mites find uninviting. Japanese beetles, which are a serious problem in many parts of the eastern United States, are less likely to settle in beds where garlic is interplanted. It won't stop a heavy infestation on its own, but it lowers the baseline pressure, and garlic offers something most companion plants don't. It gives you a real harvest. You're defending your tomatoes, peppers, and strawberries with a crop you'll actually pull out of the ground in July and hang in your kitchen to cure. That dual role is part of what makes garlic one of the highest value plants in a companion planting system. Now, a practical note about alliums that a lot of gardening content overlooks. Alliums don't play well with everyone. They can stunt the growth of beans and peas specifically, so keep them apart. That's a real limitation, not a theoretical one, and it's why thoughtful placement matters. Companion planting isn't about cramming everything together. It's about putting the right plants near the right crops, while keeping them away from the ones that suffer from the pairing. Now let's shift to a completely different strategy. Trap cropping. Instead of repelling pests or masking your crops, you deliberately plant something the pests prefer even more. You invite them in on purpose, to a location you choose, away from the crops you actually want to protect. And the plant that does this best is nasturtium. Nasturtiums are one of the most effective trap crops available to a home gardener. Their tender leaves and juicy stems are almost irresistible to aphids, flea beetles, squash bugs, and cabbage white caterpillars. Plant nasturtiums around the edges of your squash, cucumber, and cabbage beds, and something remarkable happens. The pests go for the nasturtiums first. You'll often see nasturtium leaves covered in aphids, while the nearby vegetables stay relatively clean. This is not a failure of the nasturtium. This is exactly what you want. The pest population is concentrated on a plant you can monitor, manage, and if necessary, cut back or remove entirely, taking the pest population with it. And nasturtiums do more than just absorb pest attention. Their vivid orange, red, and yellow flowers attract hoverflies and predatory wasps, whose larvae feed on aphids. So, the same plant that pulls aphids in also brings in the insects that eat them. You're creating a deliberate hotspot of pest activity in a place where predators can find food, while your main crops get to grow in relative peace. And on top of that, nasturtium leaves and flowers are edible. The leaves have a peppery, watercress-like bite. The flowers are beautiful in a salad. So even the trap crop gives you something back. The only thing to remember with nasturtiums is to check them regularly. If one plant becomes overwhelmed with aphids, don't leave it that way indefinitely. Pinch back the worst infested stems and compost them, or replace the plant entirely. The goal is to draw pests in, not to build a permanent aphid nursery next to your vegetables. Which brings us to marigolds. And this is where I need to be especially careful, because marigolds are probably the most overpromised plant in all of companion gardening. Here's what marigolds actually do, clearly and honestly. French marigolds, Tagetes patula specifically, produce root secretions that suppress root knot nematodes. That part is well documented. Nematodes are microscopic soil pests that attack plant roots, causing swelling, poor growth, and reduced yields, and they're often invisible until harvest reveals the damage. Planting French marigolds densely in a bed for a full season, then turning them under, measurably reduces nematode populations in that soil. The Royal Horticultural Society and multiple university extension programs support this finding. If you have a known nematode problem, this is a real, proven use. What marigolds do not reliably do is repel every insect that lands on them. Some studies show modest repellent effects on whiteflies and certain aphid species. Other studies show marigolds actually attracting spider mites. The above-ground pest-repelling reputation is much weaker than the underground nematode suppression. So here's the realistic way to use marigolds. Plant French marigolds as a dense border or an in-bed crop specifically for nematode management, especially in beds where you grow tomatoes, potatoes, and peppers. Enjoy the flowers. Appreciate the pollinators they bring in, which is a real benefit. But don't expect them to be a force field against all pests above ground. That expectation sets you up for disappointment, and it's the kind of claim that makes experienced gardeners roll their eyes at companion planting advice in general. Now, I want to pause on something important. Everything I've covered so far, scent masking with herbs, chemical deterrence with alliums, trap cropping with nasturtiums, soil protection with marigolds, works best when you combine several of them in the same space. A tomato bed with basil tucked between the plants, garlic along the edges, marigolds at the corners for nematode protection, and nasturtiums trailing down one side as a trap crop for aphids. That's a system. Each plant addresses a different pressure. The combined effect is greater than any single plant would produce on its own. The final layer, the one that completes the system, isn't about defense at all. It's about recruitment, bringing in the insects that eat your pests for you. And that's where the next plant becomes genuinely powerful. The most underused strategy in home gardens is the one that does the most work once it's in place. You don't kill the pests, you don't repel them, you simply create conditions where other insects, the ones already in your area looking for food, come in and do the hunting for you. Every garden is full of beneficial insects waiting for a reason to stay. Parasitic wasps that lay eggs inside caterpillars. Hoverflies, whose larvae devour aphids by the hundred. Lacewings, ladybugs, predatory beetles. These insects are already flying over your garden. The question is whether you give them a reason to land and settle. Dill is one of the best plants in the world for this job. Its umbrella-shaped flower clusters, called umbels, are structured in a way that tiny predatory insects can actually feed from. Most garden flowers are too deep or too large for small wasps and hoverflies to access. Dill is the opposite. The flowers are flat, exposed, and loaded with accessible nectar and pollen, which is exactly what those beneficial insects need to fuel themselves while they hunt. When you let dill bloom instead of harvesting every stem for the kitchen, you're essentially setting up a feeding station that attracts the insects that control your pest population. The most dramatic example is the parasitic wasp. These are tiny, mostly harmless-looking insects, but what they do is remarkable. An adult female wasp finds a caterpillar or a hornworm, pierces it, and lays her eggs inside. The larvae hatch and feed from within, eventually killing the host. If you've ever seen a tomato hornworm covered in small white cocoons, that was parasitic wasp larvae finishing their work. This is natural biological pest control at full force. And it happens in your garden for free, if you give the wasps something to feed on between hunts. Dill does that. So do other umbellifers like fennel, cilantro when it bolts, and wild carrot. Let at least some of these flower every year. The payoff is measurable. Hoverflies do similar work with aphids. The adult flies feed on nectar from dill flowers, and then they lay eggs directly on or near aphid colonies. When the hoverfly larvae hatch, they immediately start consuming aphids. A single hoverfly larva can eat hundreds of aphids before it pupates. Plant enough dill, let it bloom, and you're maintaining a small army of aphid predators that shows up exactly where you need them. The trick with dill that most gardeners miss is this: you have to let it flower. A lot of us harvest dill early for pickling and cooking, which is fine. But if you harvest every plant before it blooms, you get zero beneficial insect recruitment. So plan for both. Grow enough dill that you can harvest some for the kitchen and leave some to flower and seed. Once it seeds, dill will often volunteer every following year on its own, which means your beneficial insect recruitment becomes self-sustaining. Marigolds contribute to this layer as well. despite my earlier caution about their above-ground claims. Their flowers attract ladybugs, lacewings, parasitic wasps, and hoverflies, all of which are major pest predators. So while marigolds aren't the universal pest repellent they're often sold as, they do genuinely function as a beneficial insect magnet. That's a real, defensible role for them in your garden, alongside their nematode suppression. Now let me pull all of this together into something you can actually apply this season, because 10 plants discussed one at a time is useful information, but 10 plants working together in your beds is where the real change happens. Picture a standard raised bed with tomatoes as the main crop. Here's what a layered companion planting strategy looks like in practice. Basil tucked between every 2 or 3 tomato plants, not just one plant, but a cluster, for aromatic disruption of hornworm moths. Chives or garlic along the edges for sulfur-based aphid and spider mite deterrence. French marigolds at the 4 corners for nematode suppression in the soil. A few nasturtiums trailing off one end as a trap crop for aphids and flea beetles. And a small patch of dill allowed to flower at the far side of the bed to bring in hoverflies and parasitic wasps. That bed is now defended on 5 different mechanisms at once. Not one of them is a silver bullet. Together, they create conditions where pest pressure drops dramatically compared to a bed planted with tomatoes alone. For a brassica bed, the combination shifts. Thyme around the edges as ground cover and scent barrier. Rosemary at one end as a woody scent shrub, if your climate allows. A pot of mint placed near the bed to disrupt cabbage moth navigation without letting it invade the soil. Nasturtiums again as a trap crop for cabbage whites and flea beetles. And dill somewhere nearby for parasitic wasp recruitment, because parasitic wasps are among the most effective predators of cabbage white caterpillars. Layered together, that's a brassica bed that survives a season with a fraction of the caterpillar damage a bare bed would suffer. A few honest admissions before I wrap this up. Companion planting works, but it doesn't work overnight, and it doesn't work perfectly. The first season you try it, you'll still see pests. The second season, if you observe carefully and adjust placement, you'll see fewer. By the third season, as perennials like chives, thyme, and rosemary settle in, and your self-seeding annuals like dill and nasturtiums start returning on their own, you'll start to notice that the garden feels quieter. There are fewer outbreaks, fewer emergencies. The pests that do arrive are managed by predators before you'd normally have to intervene. That's what a healthy, layered garden ecosystem actually looks like. It's not pest-free, it's pest-balanced. Companion planting is also not a substitute for the other things that keep a garden healthy. Rotate your crops from year to year so pests and diseases don't build up in the same soil. Clean up infected plant material promptly. Feed your soil with compost so your plants grow vigorously, because stressed plants attract more pests than healthy ones. Use physical barriers like insect netting for brassicas in areas where cabbage white pressure is especially heavy. Companion planting is one important piece of a larger system. When you treat it that way, it delivers. When you treat it as the entire answer, it disappoints. Start small. Pick 3 or 4 of these 10 plants and work them into your garden this season. Basil between your tomatoes. Chives around your carrots or roses. Nasturtiums on the edge of your squash bed. Dill allowed to flower somewhere sunny. Those 4 alone will make a difference you can see by late summer. Add more next year. Let the perennials establish. Over time, your garden becomes a place where the balance is already in your favor before a single pest arrives. If any of this was useful to you today, type GROW in the comments and hit the like button. It helps this channel reach more gardeners who are tired of spraying, tired of hand-picking caterpillars off their cabbage, and ready to let the garden start defending itself. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.